In September 1938, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany, threatened to start a war in Europe if Czechoslovakia didn't give up the Sudetenland, a region along its border where many ethnic Germans lived. To avoid conflict, the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met in Munich on September 29th to 30th, 1938. They agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace. However, Czechoslovakia wasn't even invited to the meeting. Less than 6 months later, on March 15, 1939, Hitler broke the agreement and invaded the Czech regions of Bohemia and Moravia. The next day, from Prague Castle, he declared these areas as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. More than 118,000 Jews living there now found themselves under Nazi control, including a young girl named Dita Polachová. Dita and her parents endured years under Nazi occupation before being sent to the Theresienstadt ghetto. Then, in December 1943, they were deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Between October 26, 1942, and October 28, 1944, the Nazis transported nearly 47,000 Jews from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz in 27 separate trains. Life in Theresienstadt, though harsh, still held some value, but in Auschwitz, survival meant nothing. When Dita's transport arrived at the camp at night, she and the others were blinded by powerful floodlights. Exhausted and confused, they were met by SS guards with snarling dogs and prisoners in striped uniforms who beat them with sticks. As soon as they arrived, the prisoners were forced to leave all their belongings behind and line up, men and boys in one group, women and girls in another. They were marched into a wooden shack where they spent the night sitting on the freezing hard floor. The next morning, Dita, her mother, and the other women were ordered to undress and take an ice-cold shower. Soaking wet, they were then forced to run barefoot through the snow to another barracks, where they were given tattered civilian clothes and worn-out shoes instead of the striped uniforms worn by most Auschwitz prisoners. Fortunately, Dita had kept her boots on during the shower, which saved them from being taken away. After that, all the prisoners were tattooed on their left arms. From that moment on, Dita was no longer called by her name. She was just a number, 73,305. She and the others were placed in the B2 Bay Camp, known as the Theresienstadt Family Camp in Auschwitz. This section was created on September 8, 1943, specifically for Jews deported from the Theresienstadt ghetto. Around 18,000 people were sent there between 1943 and 1944. It was one of 9 subcamps in Auschwitz-Birkenau and was the second after the Gypsy family camp, where men were allowed to stay with their families, though they still slept in separate barracks. The Nazis set up this camp for propaganda purposes, but the conditions were just as brutal as in the rest of Auschwitz. Prisoners suffered from extreme hunger, harsh beatings, grueling forced labor, and barely any access to water. The camp itself consisted of 32 wooden barracks, originally built as horse stables. They had no windows, just a few small openings in the walls that barely let in any air. Each barrack in the camp held around 300 prisoners. The camp had a single washroom barrack with a row of taps that barely dripped cold, murky brown water. There was also a latrine, a long concrete row with holes divided into 2 sections by a strip of sackcloth. One side was for men, the other for women. But the sackcloth only covered the middle of a person's body, leaving their face and lower half exposed, adding to the humiliation. When Dita arrived, she saw prisoners who had been deported from Theresienstadt 3 months earlier. They looked different, pale, almost gray and lifeless. No one smiled. They spoke in hushed, eerie tones, repeating strange things about gas chambers and chimneys where they would all end up. When they pointed to the chimneys, where flames flickered at night and gray ash floated in the air like snow, the new arrivals didn't understand. But in time, Dita learned the horrifying truth. The ash and the smell came from the crematoria, where the bodies of those murdered in the gas chambers were burned. Roll calls took place every morning and evening. If the numbers didn't match, the process dragged on for hours, forcing prisoners to stand still in freezing cold or scorching heat. Food was scarce. Each day, prisoners received only a bowl of watery soup at midday, and in the evening, a piece of bread with a spoonful of margarine or fake jam. Hunger consumed them. Eating was all they could think about. One day in February, during roll call, Dita realized her father wasn't there. Later that night, she sneaked into the men's barracks and found him lying on his bunk, eyes closed. When she saw that he hadn't touched his soup, she knew his time was near. That night, he passed away. Dita's mother didn't know about her husband's death right away. She was sick and confined to the hospital for infectious diseases, and Dita wasn't allowed to visit. Instead, she had to pass the heartbreaking news through a small gap in the wooden wall. Despite their grief, both were relieved that he had passed away naturally rather than being sent to the gas chambers. One of the few privileges in the Theresienstadt family camp was the children's block, located in Barrack 31. During the day, children were allowed to stay there until the afternoon roll call. The barrack was empty except for small stools, where the children sat in groups with an adult who guided them. They played games, sang songs, and even received secret lessons, though only through spoken word. There were no toys, pencils, or paper. The only real resources were a small collection of 12 to 14 books, secretly smuggled in by prisoners working in the luggage sorting area. Dita was in charge of these books, earning her the title of the camp's librarian. The head of the children's block was Fredy Hirsch, whom Dita had known from Prague and Theresienstadt. He managed to convince the camp authorities to allow the block, arguing that it would keep the children occupied while their parents were forced to work. He also secured extra food for them, arranged for their barrack to be heated, and even ensured their roll calls were conducted indoors. Hirsch was strict about hygiene, insisting that the children wash daily, even in the freezing winter of 1943 to 44. He also conducted regular lice inspections. Because of his efforts, the death rate among the children remained almost zero, while the overall mortality rate in the family camp reached 25% in just 6 months. In February 1944, the Auschwitz resistance movement uncovered the meaning behind the coded term SB6. It stood for Special Treatment 6, which meant execution in the gas chambers after 6 months. Realizing what was coming, the prisoners decided to fight back. They planned an uprising to set fire to the camp, break through the gates, and run for their lives. Fredy Hirsch was chosen as one of the leaders of the planned uprising. But on March 8, 1944, just an hour before it was supposed to start, he asked the doctors for a tranquilizer because he was feeling extremely anxious. Instead of a small dose, they gave him an overdose on purpose. The doctors had been promised by Josef Mengele that they wouldn't be killed along with the rest of the Theresienstadt family camp, as long as their skills were still useful to the SS. Because of the overdose, Hirsch fell into a deep sleep and never gave the signal to begin the uprising. Later that same day, still unconscious, he and 3,800 other men, women, and children from the September transport were loaded onto trucks and taken straight to the gas chambers where they were killed. After the September transport was wiped out, the children's block continued operating under a new leader. But Dita, who had arrived at Auschwitz in December 1943, knew that her 6 months were nearly up. By June 1944, it would be her turn. Then, in May, new orders came from Germany. They needed prisoners who were still fit to work in the German weapons industry. A selection process began, led by the infamous Auschwitz doctor Josef Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. Men aged 16 to 45 and women aged 16 to 40 were told to report. Each had to strip, stand straight, and state just 3 things: their tattoo number, their age, and their profession. Dita was only 14, but she knew that if she told the truth, she would be sent to the gas chamber. So, when it was her turn, she confidently said she was 16 and that her profession was a painter. Mengele looked at her and asked, "A house painter or a portrait painter?" Without hesitation, Dita answered, "A portrait painter." Mengele looked at Dita and asked, "Can you paint my portrait?" Without hesitation, she answered, "Jawohl," yes. With a wave of his hand, Mengele sent her to the group assigned for hard labor. But her mother wasn't as lucky. She had been sent to the other group. Refusing to be separated from her daughter, she managed to sneak back into the line, blending in with the other frail women. Against all odds, she passed the selection, and Dita and her mother remained together. By July 1944, the Theresienstadt family camp was completely liquidated. The remaining 7,000 men, women, and children, including infants, were murdered in the gas chambers. Of those who survived the selection, about 2,000 women and 1,000 men were sent to other concentration camps in Germany. Dita and her mother were among those transported to Neuengamme, a network of sub-camps near Hamburg. As the war neared its end, the death toll in Neuengamme skyrocketed. In the winter of 1944–45, nearly 1,700 prisoners died each month. By February 1945, the number rose to 2,500. Prisoners faced not only starvation and disease but also frequent air raids. Almost every night the skies lit up with bombing raids, forcing prisoners to take shelter in rat-infested basements. Their daily routine was grueling, waking at 5 a.m., standing in formation for roll call, and then marching to perform back-breaking labor. They were forced to clear rubble from bombed-out houses, dig trenches, or shovel snow from the streets. Despite their own suffering, some German civilians secretly left food for the starving prisoners, small acts of humanity in the midst of horror. By March 1945, the SS began emptying the Neuengamme sub-camps. Dita and her mother were among the prisoners transported to Bergen-Belsen, a camp infamous for its horrific conditions. Upon arrival, they were met with a nightmare. There was no running water, barely any food, and extreme overcrowding. Thousands of prisoners were arriving on death marches from other camps. Many were already dead when the transports reached the camp, and those too weak to walk had to be hauled in by truck. In one instance, out of 1,900 prisoners on a transport, over 500 arrived dead. At Bergen-Belsen, survival became almost impossible. The prisoners received no food, and the freezing winter made things worse. The overcrowding was unbearable.